Yeah, g'day and welcome to another episode of Act TV. It's great to have you with us as we unpack what's happened today and bring on another very special guest, Andrew Hoggard, President of Federated Farmers, dairy farmer from the Manawatu, and as he described himself to me just a few seconds ago, general dog's body around the farm. He's pulled himself out of calving to come and join us and have a bit of a discussion about some of the issues facing rural New Zealand. And isn't there an avalanche of regulatory burden coming from central government centralising just about everything, it seems, whether it's significant natural areas or the climate change policy of the Zero Carbon Act, the negotiations with other countries over climate policy, free trade deals with other countries, Three Waters, Resource Management Act reform, fresh water. Basically, who'd be a farmer? You barely have time to produce food for the world when you're dealing with this onslaught from government. So we're really looking forward to unpacking that with Andrew. We're also going to have the authentic voice of rural New Zealand in the ACT Party caucus, Mark Cameron, our rural dairy farmer. He's going to be coming on for some hot takes of what he's facing and what Northlanders are facing, having been kind of cut off from the rest of the world by the plague in Auckland. Now, we've said that we're going to keep doing ACT TV every night at 7 o'clock weekdays until Auckland has its restrictions lifted and is no longer in level 4. So if you're in Auckland, our heart goes out to you night after night, and we thank you for coming along and watching. It's been an interesting day for government today for a number of reasons. They've introduced a bunch of new treatments. Monoclonal antibodies, they say, are going to be approved soon. These are drugs that can help to boost your immune system and help you fight off a virus. Pretty helpful thing to have right now. What's interesting is that the treatments they're talking about have been approved by the FDA as long ago as last October, in Japan in May, and again by the FDA this June. In other words, things that Ashley Bloomfield was excitedly talking about today are things that actually happened in other countries months ago. So great progress. We need to use better technology and better treatments to deal with this virus. But once again, it's ACT's role to point out that we should have been far more proactive and prepared to work with others a long time ago. We've also been calling today for a lot more transparency in the way the government uses data around the COVID outbreak. You take a look at what the Singaporean Ministry of Health is prepared to share with its people. Every day they publish an update with tables, the same data each day, obviously different numbers, but they actually make sure that everyone understands the data that their government is working with. This is a country where you're not allowed to chew gum, but at least they tell you what's going on. And what sort of data do they reveal? Well, they'll tell you how many cases, how many hospitalizations, how many ventilated on oxygen, how many in ICU, and how many of those people were vaccinated, so people can get an idea of what's going on and make up their own mind. Wouldn't it be helpful, for example, if the government was prepared to tell us what have been all the results from their wastewater testing today? How many people currently have a booking for vaccination on each day for the next few weeks? That really matters because it might give us an idea of why the numbers are down. Is it because they throttled off all of the vaccine booking slots because they were worried they were going to run out? Or have we actually come to a point where there are very few people left who actually want to be vaccinated? One of them is bad news for the government. I would argue the other is bad news for New Zealand's plan to recover. But at the moment, how many bookings per day are happening into the future? And we have to fly blind, or at least the government is taking data that we've all paid for by taxpayers and choosing to selectively release some of it each day. And you usually have to wait for 20 minutes of pronouncements from the PM at the podium of truth, or whatever she's calling it these days, before that taxpayer-funded data is actually released. And even then, only selectively for the purposes of the government's political agenda. ACT has been calling for them to publish all the data, a bit like Singapore. What do they know about testing, tracing, vaccine bookings on a daily basis in the same format so we can compare one day to another, rather than being snowed by selective releases of information that actually we've all paid for and we own, that should be transparent for everyone to make their judgments on. But that's all finished for now. We're going to talk about what has been happening in rural New Zealand for the primary industry sector that not only fed this country through the lockdown, but continued to operate and feeds about 40 million people outside New Zealand's borders as well. I'm really thrilled to bring on Mark Cameron, the rural dairy farmer, ex-party MP, and as I call him, the authentic voice of rural New Zealand. Mark, how are you going up there?
Yeah, cracking good, David. How are we? I've just got another shower going across up here. Yeah, farming's pretty torrid at the moment. It's a wet old time in Northland.
And have you finished carving? Or have the cows finished carving? Might be a better.
99% of the way. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Oh, look, David, we're 99% of the way through, which is really, really good. A lot of pressure on farm in terms of ground conditions, but the cows themselves are milking well. And as we say, and as the days get longer, the winds get stronger. So yeah, a lot of changeable weather, but calving's over.
Okay, well, it sounds like you got it under control, and we're looking forward to seeing you back in Parliament next week, because you Northlanders can now actually fly over the city of the plague and come here to Wellington. So you're going to be back on Tuesday for the House sitting, and hopefully getting stuck in on behalf of rural New Zealand.
Oh, looking forward to it. It's been probably three and a bit weeks been away. There's a lot to arrest. We've got S&A conversations to have, freshwater reforms and the changes to that. My members' bill is due to be debated shortly, which was fortuitously drawn. That talks about freshwater reforms and what that will mean in terms of giving oversight back to council. So yeah, it'll be fantastic to be back into the parliamentary process.
Well, everyone's looking forward to having you back in Parliament, except for the government, of course. Let's bring on our special guest for today. We're really honoured to have the President of Federated Farmers, as he said, all-round dog's body on the farm, dairy farmer from the Manawatu, and I have to say, really, really good guy and extremely bright guy. I always learn something from talking with Andrew Hoggard. So thank you, Andrew, for coming along. It's great to have you. And how's things going on your farm at the moment?
Like Mark, very wet. We've sort of, we were doing all right for a while, and then it just, last couple of days bucketed down. Last week's been pretty, poor weather. But we'll get through. It's sort of that time of year where everything looks not the greatest, but then things change pretty quickly as the days get longer, as Mark said.
Yeah, well, let's jump right into it, and let's jump in deep. Climate policy. New Zealand has always been in a special position compared with the rest of the world, because a large portion of New Zealand's carbon emissions are methane, and methane behaves very differently from other greenhouse gases. It's a more potent greenhouse gas, but it also deteriorates quite rapidly. So the long-term effects are very different from the short-term effects. So that leads to a different treatment. If you're worried about the greenhouse effect, then you've got to think hard about how to treat methane. And certainly, whatever we may think, we know a lot of other countries, a lot of people in trade negotiations, and a lot of consumers of New Zealand products. And I know New Zealand farmers, probably more than any others in the world, are actually focused on the consumers, because we don't have the subsidies and controls that some other farmers have, and I would argue hold them back. So we got to think about how to treat methane. Can you talk us through some of the recent developments? I know the EU, the US are starting to advocate policies that would disadvantage a country like New Zealand that is heavier on methane and lighter on other types of greenhouse gas.
Yeah, so I mean, we've seen in the paper today they're talking about 30%. They want to sign up to a 30% reduction. And I just, headline numbers like that to me aren't based on solid science. They're just a number someone's gone and plucked out of the air somewhere and decided that sounds good. And probably a marketing person.
Funny, it's exactly 30, huh?
Yeah. And I think it's, what we really need globally is a proper discussion around. We've got that paragraph in the Paris Accord which says, we shouldn't hamper food production. We need to maintain food production. but reduce emissions. So that becomes a question around, where can we produce food the most efficiently? Well, obviously, New Zealand is a great candidate. So we don't want to hamper food production in New Zealand. If anything, we probably want to increase it. And that's the sort of discussion the world needs to have around how do we do this smartly? How do we do it sensibly? What are the barriers to much better efficiencies globally? And one of the best talks I ever heard on this subject actually was by Senior World Vice President of the World Wildlife Fund, who, surprisingly enough for a green NGO, talked about the way to meet the planetary boundaries was through free trade and allowing food to be and stuff to be produced where it can be done most efficiently, ship it to the other parts of the world rather than everyone trying to, do their own little bit like we tried to do back in the 80s and 70s here in New Zealand with manufacturing and the like.
So you shouldn't judge a first lesson is don't judge a book by its cover. You could have a World Wildlife Fund vice president who's actually a free trader, and that's a welcome development.
Yeah.
But there's an important point here that if you see climate change as a global problem, and that seems to be the only way you could see it, if you're worried about it, that's how you should look at it.
Yeah.
Then actually, from a global perspective, it might be smarter if more food production was done in New Zealand, given the efficiency of producing protein here versus some other countries.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you look at dairy, which I'm very familiar with, New Zealand's footprint's 0.8 a kg of CO2 equivalent per kg of milk. The world average is, I think, 2.4 or 2.6. The next best
three times more. Did I hear that
something
right?
like that? Yeah. And, the next best countries are at 1.2 or 1.3. So they're, 30% more than us. So, simple economics, it makes sense to produce as much as you can in New Zealand at that lowest footprint in terms of a climate change, if you're just focusing on climate change. Now, there may be other things like water quality, etc., which might mean, okay, there's only a certain, limit that we can go to. But if you're just focusing on climate change, then to reduce New Zealand's production based on climate change makes no sense whatsoever.
This is a really important point. So if we can follow that, can the New Zealand government follow that? Because they're on the world stage doing things like negotiating free trade, and it'd be great if we could have a free trade agreement with the UK after they kind of jilted us, 40, 50 years ago now. Do you think the New Zealand government is actually taking that view and advocating on behalf of New Zealand's interests when they, as it sounds like, actually coincide with the world's interest on this topic?
Unfortunately, probably not. The impression I get is they seem to be focused on worrying about what their mates in Europe are doing and saying, rather than, if we could lead a whole range of developing countries we could build up quite a coalition of the willing, if you want to borrow a phrase, of developing countries who have a similar sort of footprint or whatever you call it, makeup of their climate diagram.
Composition.
Yeah, composition to us in New Zealand. And so, but they just seem to want to do what Europe's doing and all the lovies in Europe are doing, rather than actually what makes most sense globally. What's the most scientifically rational point?
I don't think the French have ever really been friends of us. I mean, there was the nuclear testing, the Rainbow Warrior thing, and then they don't want us to be in the EU. So
don't forget that World Cup quarterfinal.
Yeah, well, exactly. So a lot of terrible grievances we have against the French, although we do love them for other reasons, like the bread and the cheese and stuff. But look, thinking about who are some of those other countries that you're alluding to who are actually friends that New Zealand has common cause with?
They're all across South America, all those South American countries. Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, they all have very similar amounts of agriculture. And then if you go into Asia, people seem to forget that the production of rice is also a very big contributor to methane. And so you've got a lot of Asian developing countries that also have quite a high methane component due to that rice production. So there's a lot of countries that we could be allies with in this debate, but we choose not to be, I feel.
See, I just want to say to our audience, this is why I love talking to Andrew Hoggard. Always learn something, because he is a sharp and original thinker. The idea that New Zealand should be looking for friends that we might not have traditionally had as friends or allies, but they have the same composition of their emissions profile as us. This is the kind of new thinking that I think New Zealand needs. So thank you for that. Can I just see if I think Mark may have had some internet trouble, such as the curse of doing business in rural Northland. Mark, are you still with us, mate? You haven't disappeared? Oh, there he is. He's back. So, Mark, what? That's a really good discussion about trade and
yeah.
What are some of the things that you've been thinking about?
Oh, look, to be quite honest, what we've seen up here a lot is the topical conversation around SCNAs and what freshwater reforms will look like, especially to the ownership of water assets and how they're used on farm, irrigation, some of the pilot systems that have been set up, and multi-generational investment and what that will look like. Freshwater reforms are also having a big effect in terms of DIN levels, on-farm operation, and we really are hearing a lot of concern around the lack of regional insight versus a big centrist policy machine in Wellington that doesn't understand rural New Zealand.
Yeah, can I bring Andrew back in there? Because I mean, you guys have an unenviable task of trying to be the connector between a rural New Zealand that has just done groundswell and is pretty annoyed. And when I go out and do public meetings, I can understand why people are annoyed. I mean, and I just think, if someone like me, I mean, I represent Epsom, which in many ways is the most urban electorate in New Zealand, but I feel like I can at least understand the edges of what is annoying rural folks. Why is there such a divide? I mean, you guys are the ones who, have the unenviable task of trying to reach out to these guys in Wellington. Do you think, is there something going on that New Zealand's becoming a more fractured society, or is it just that this particular government has a different view? Do you have any insights into that?
There was a good post or comment someone made after the protests, and it's not that there's an urban-rural divide, it's that there's a New Zealand-Wellington divide. And that's how I feel at times when we're talking with government officials, trying to make them see, well, sometimes they can see sense, but then they have a minister telling them, no, this is what's happening and it's not changing. And just trying to, it's almost, I guess my feeling is there's a plan and we're pushing the plan through and get out of our way at times. That's how it feels. And to be brutally honest, the plan hasn't been that well thought through. If you look at so many of the sort of pieces of reform or legislation that's coming through, it's all coming in a very haphazard manner. It's not logical in how it's been done. If I was in charge of putting all this, if I wanted to, if I even thought any of this was smart and I was doing it, to me, you would do the local government reform first, decide what people want from their local government, and then you do your 3 quarters, your RMA reform, given that people know you've had that feedback as to what people want the role of local government to be in it. And you'd follow through in a logical pattern. And then after you've done your RMA reform, then you'd do your essential fresh water regulations and everything. Instead, we've gone completely the opposite way, or the government has. And so, one thing I worry about is we'll get through all this RMA reform, or whatever it's called, the Natural Build Act and the spatial planning one. We've had to do all this essential fresh water. All these councils will have had to redo all their plans by 2024 that in some cases, they may have just done a plan and now they have to throw it away. And then once all the RMA reform's done, with this new plan they've done to meet the essential fresh water, suddenly all that's not compliant with the new RMA, got to do it again. So I really, really worry that we're just opening ourselves up to a massive amount of costs. The only ones that are going to win really are going to be lawyers.
Yeah, so the lesson for those of us that want to be in government in a couple of years, and I look at the polls tonight, and I'm really pleased with how ACT's going, maybe we'll get there, is that instead of working, I think there is a logic to what they're doing, but it's logical from the point of view of a minister's office in the beehive. It's not logical from the point of view of the poor people who are actually subjected to all this stuff, the end user, the people that are just trying to make an honest buck and feed the world. So the lesson for us is we should be saying, okay, where's the end user and what are the things that have to happen? Which plans have to be written? And at what point do we introduce each sort of step in the sequence? That is, if you think all this is a good idea, which, I think is also highly questionable. Hey, can I ask something totally different? Just something that always interested me and continues, because I'm interested in technology. I'm interested in science. I think one of the great things about living in a free society is that we can accumulate all this knowledge and do things better and smarter. But when it comes to synthetic proteins, where is that on the radar for you guys? I mean, in theory, at least, it could be quite a disruptive threat to running a dairy farm as we currently think of it. But I'm sure you guys have thought about that. How do you guys think about it?
This was when I first got onto the Federated Farmers Board, so nearly 8 years ago as the dairy chairperson. This was one of the first interviews I had to do. There was some crowd in Silicon Valley that was supposedly inventing, cow-free milk. And, I've had multiple interviews on this, that the end is nigh. What are you going to do? You've got to jump over to this. And the reality, when you look at it, yes, the alternative market's growing, but so is the natural market. And I heard some good stats. Yes, the alternative meat market might go up to some 100 billion by 2050 or something, but the natural meat is up in the trillions. So to my mind, there's always going to be a market for the real stuff, and we do it really well in New Zealand. And so, I'm quite a reader of science fiction, and in a lot of those novels, they have the fake stuff, and it's never the premium consumers are eating that stuff. It's always the poor masses.
Yeah, well, I know personally I won't be eating a fake steak if I can avoid it. I want the real thing from an actual cow. But that's just me. I suspect that, for what it's worth, I think New Zealand, if there is a big shift, New Zealand will remain the place you go to get the real stuff at a high quality level. And because we don't have the crazy sort of policies of subsidies and quotas and tariffs, all the crap that other countries have, I think our farming community will be nimble enough to adapt to it. But that's just my...
There's also I'll just add, there's a really good story to tell for some of the natural products, because when you look at, particularly in the milk space, when you got these nut juices that they're claiming are milks, and they say, the greenhouse gas footprint is so much less per litre. Well, actually, you shouldn't do it on litre. You should do it on how much protein is actually in there. And then if you look at the protein, it's the quality of protein. So that's called the DIAD score or DIAS score or something like that. And when you really get down to it, and the actual nutrition that you're getting from the product, the greenhouse gas footprint of the natural thing is far better than the fake stuff, because with the fake stuff, really all you get is water.
So you can drink as much nut juice as you like, but at the end of the day, we should be focused on measuring nutrition. And it's so often the denominator that you divide something by that gives you the real measure. Hey, we've gone way over time for our usual chat, and our producer's sending me through a message here saying questions. So sorry to our listeners, but we've got Glenn here who says, have emissions actually increase in the agricultural sector? Well, that's just a basic matter of fact that I'm sure you could probably put to bed.
Since 2006, according to the MFE stats, in terms of methane, we've actually decreased. So 2006 was the peak year. there was a graph I saw that sort of made assumptions back into way back 1840, and actually under that graph, our peak was early 80s when the government was paying us to have lots of undernourished ewes. So that's what subsidies do for the environment.
Yeah, I wonder what the methane emissions of mowers was too, because we got a guy in Parliament called Trevor Mallard, and he said he was going to bring the mowers back, and it's probably a good thing he didn't, because that could have affected our profile as well. But anyway, Trevor has a lot of ideas, and some of them are good, and then he has his other ideas. Look, we got Steve, and this is something that I don't know, you might be able to chime in on, Mark. Steve asked, do farmers feel people in the city hear them after the groundswell? I'm the representative of the city here. I can say yes. I think there's a real consciousness of it from people I talk to when I'm actually allowed back in my city. But what do you guys say?
I know the thing that blew me away with the protest, and I was driving along in my ute, was the amount of people in town that were actually out on the sidewalk waving.
I was just saying, was your ute electric?
No, hell no.
Oh, just
it's an actual legitimate ute, though.
Sorry, guys, I'm struggling to hear you.
Well, I tell you what, you give us your answer, Mark. I know there'll be a bit of a delay, and then I cut off Andrew, and I'm sorry about that. But you give us your answer, and then we'll cut back. No, it might be. No, I think he's a victim of that Northland internet. I'm sorry, Andrew. You said you were driving along with your ute, and then I was making Jacinda jokes about your ute. But what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just blown away by the number of people on the sidewalk waving. Amount of people from town that were, clapping, cheering, taking videos. So I was not expecting that. So that kind of shows that actually there was a hell of a lot of people in town that do care. Yeah,
I guess that it goes back to what you said a bit earlier about it. It's not actually a rural-urban divide. It's a New Zealand-Wellington divide. Can I just finish with another question that I know that people have been bringing up, and it's around mental health. There's already challenges. I mean, farming is something that you do often alone, which can be good and can be bad. You face a lot of pressure. Sometimes you face pressures you can't really control, like no farmer can control global commodity prices. And then, of course, there's been this real assault, first of all, on the actual regulations, but also some of the attitudes. And I know Mark has told the story of kids being made to write essays at school saying, basically, my mummy and daddy are bad people because they farm, and that obviously has an effect. What's the state of mental health in rural New Zealand and for people engaged in farming? And do you have any advice or tips for people that are struggling with that?
I think it's probably on the low at the moment. I guess it's that time of year where everyone's busy. The amount of regulation is weighing on a lot of people's minds. Worried about the future. They're seeing rules that are impractical, haven't been properly thought through, asking themselves how they're going to comply with that and be able to fulfill all that. It's not in a great space really, and the time of year and the weather doesn't help. I think this best solution I can give is a problem shared is a problem halved. So there's some good. I saw recently has been launched a campaign, lean on a gate and talk to a mate. Things like that. And, I know in the past we've had some really poor springs and really bad weather. Some of the stuff we've done is just once calving's over, it's organise a, drink at the local pub for everyone, and everyone just has a yarn, realises that it's not them alone. Everyone's in the same boat. For some reason you're happier to know that yes, the boat's sinking, but there's lots of other people in it with you.
You're on a ground with a lot of other people.
Yeah.
All right. Well, look, we're actually right on past, so I got to say goodbye. But look, thank you, Andrew. Like I said at the start, always educating to talk to you, and you always have crisp insights. I hope our viewers have enjoyed it too. I want to say apologies for Mark. He really has been a victim of rural New Zealand internet, but he's apparently going to get an upgrade soon, so we can talk to him a bit more easily. In the meantime, if you want to get involved with Feds, if you're in the farming community, I think we've just seen the level of thought and intelligence that's coming from a very genuine, authentic person. And Andrew Hoggard is the Feds leader, so we fully endorse them. And for everybody in rural New Zealand, I know there's been a bit of city folk, or at least Wellington folk, beating on you. Well, here's one very urban person who also works in Parliament, who has got your back, because I appreciate and value what you do, and I think we got to fix up a lot of this regulatory overload that I think Andrew skewered pretty well in his description. Tomorrow night, Act TV will be back again at 7, and I think we may have Des Gorman back again. I could be going off script here, but there's a lot to talk about as this lockdown rolls on, and the alternatives don't seem to be very clear. So we're going to get back to the epidemiology of COVID and the options for managing it. And if I'm wrong about that, then it might actually be Brooke Van Velden talking about the impacts of the new taxes and healthy homes regulations on landlords, especially in these lockdown conditions and the way the government's rushing those through. So it's one of those two. I may have gone off script, but either way, it's going to be a cracking show, and I hope that you look forward to seeing Act TV and enjoy watching it for another night. Until then, stay safe. Good night.